If someone told you that repairing a house could break a family, would you believe them? Because I didn't. Not until the nails I hammered, the wires I replaced, and the roof I saved became the very things used to push me out of the home I had tried so hard to make safe. I didn't grow up imagining I'd one day be sitting in a mediation room, calmly explaining why I spent $75,000 fixing someone else's property. I didn't picture myself rehearsing sentences about fairness in front of a mirror, or learning how to organize invoices like chapters in a quiet war. But life doesn't always split cleanly between right and wrong. Sometimes it splits between what you fixed and who pretends they never saw you do it. This story begins with good intentions, mine mostly. A leaking roof, exposed wires, rotting beams. The kind of dangers you don't ignore when a home is supposed to protect the people inside it. I stepped in because no one else did. I paid the contractors, filed the permits, stayed up at night researching what needed to be replaced before the house gave way. And for a while, I believed effort spoke for itself. That people would remember who held things together. But what happens when the only thing people remember is that the house stands stronger than before, and they no longer want you in it? This is the story of how quiet decisions turned into a conflict no one expected. How truth found its shape in documents. How fairness became something I had to claim, not something offered. If you're ready for the full journey, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. The first morning I stepped into the house, the air carried a faint smell of damp wood, an old, tired scent that hid under the floorboards and clung to the walls. The porch paint flaked in long curling strips, and a thin line of daylight leaked through a gap near the doorframe. I paused at the threshold, hearing the subtle groan of the old joists beneath my feet. It wasn't a pretty house, not yet, but it felt like a project I could breathe life into. I rolled my shoulders once, letting the weight of possibility settle. "We'll fix you up," I murmured, half joking, half serious, running my fingers along the chipped banister. It felt like touching a story someone stopped telling halfway through. I told myself I would finish it, quietly, patiently, the way I always did when I cared about something. Or someone. When my mother-in-law said, "Just treat it like it's your home," her voice floated out casually like she was offering me a second helping at dinner, instead of implied ownership. Something in her tone felt soft, almost generous, and I let myself believe it. I smiled, maybe too quickly, because the sentence landed like a small key dropped into my palm. Permission. Safety. A promise shaped loosely as a joke. She didn't look at me when she said it. She was wiping her hands on a towel, turning off the stove, the hall light humming above her. But I caught the warmth of the moment anyway. I tucked it away the way a child tucks a note into a pocket, certain it means more than it seems. I let that belief guide me, steady my breath, and loosen a knot in my chest I didn't realize I'd been carrying for years. I started with what mattered, structural repairs. Not the pretty things. Not curtains or pillows or whatever could be dismissed as decor. I made a list on my phone. Roof, wiring, plumbing, sealing the porch. Then rearranged the items by urgency. The electrician came first, shaking his head at the brittle, outdated wiring tucked behind the walls. "This could have sparked," he said, and I nodded, swallowing a chill. I ordered materials myself, scheduled workers, confirmed every appointment. I wrote down dates, vendor names, invoice numbers. Each step gave me a strange sense of calm, as if structure could be built not only into the house but into my life. I didn't say any of this aloud. I just kept the repairs moving, one line item after another, letting the work speak for me. It felt natural, almost instinctive, to save every receipt. Not out of suspicion or strategy, but because order soothed me. I photographed each invoice before sliding it into a folder on my desktop labeled simply House. I added notes: paid in full, materials delivered, labor complete. I didn't think of it as evidence then, more like a diary made of numbers and dates instead of sentences and feelings. The act grounded me, especially on nights when the dripping from the roof had been louder, sharper, more persistent. When I finally paid to have the leak fixed, the relief was accompanied by the soft hum of the printer spitting out another record. I filed it away. A small ritual, private, simple, mine. The first time I placed the physical folder on the kitchen table, it made a soft, crisp sound, new paper against polished wood. The cover still smelled faintly of the store, cool, chemical, untouched. I ran my thumb along the spine, feeling its promise. There wasn't much inside yet, just a few receipts, a contractor's card, a printed estimate. But it looked like a beginning, a boundary I didn't yet know I would need. The hall light flickered once above me, and I glanced up, instinctively noting another repair for later. The house felt like it was waiting, almost listening, and I exhaled a long, steady breath, letting the quiet fill the room. When the metal staple clicked, just once, clean and sharp, as I closed the folder, the sound surprised me. Too small to matter, but somehow decisive. A punctuation mark in an otherwise unfinished paragraph. The BF folded shut with a confidence I didn't quite feel yet, and for a moment the house seemed to settle around me, as if acknowledging my effort. I didn't know then that this tiny, mundane gesture would become the first tile in a long mosaic of proof. I only knew that it felt right, tidy, intentional. I pressed my palm flat on the folder, smoothing it gently. A beginning, sealed in paper. I laid out the renovation list on the kitchen table, smoothing the printed page with the side of my hand. Electrical overhaul, plumbing replacement, roof reinforcement, moisture-blocking primer, floor sealing. It looked almost like a blueprint of responsibility, my responsibility, even though the deed had her name on it. I talked her through each item slowly, the way you might explain a treatment plan before a surgery. Structural first, aesthetics later, I said, trying to sound confident, even if I felt like an amateur pretending to speak the language of contractors and city inspectors. Outside the window, the porch sagged slightly in the afternoon heat, reminding me that the house didn't care about my doubts. It needed fixing in the same practical way a body needs care, quietly, urgently, without sentiment. She nodded along, standing near the stove, and I watched her eyes drift toward the list. For one fleeting moment I thought we were aligned, two people tending to the same roof, sharing the same future, even if the paperwork disagreed. She said, "As long as the house is solid," with a small shrug, as if structural integrity were a casual preference rather than the spine of a home. The way she said it made me think she wasn't imagining contracts or reimbursements or obligations. She was simply agreeing to keep the roof from caving in. Her approval felt more like a gesture for peaceful coexistence than a defined commitment, but I accepted it anyway. I held on to that moment the way you might hold on to a warm mug on a cold morning, not because it promises anything, but because the warmth feels good while it lasts. She didn't look closely at the list. She didn't ask about cost, labor, or timelines. She just nodded, as if nodding were enough to build trust. I mistook that nod for something sturdier, a handshake in disguise, a verbal contract wrapped in domestic politeness. Neighbors noticed the changes right away. While I painted the porch railings, one of them called out from across the yard, "Looks good!" His voice floated over the fence as sunlight caught the new coat of primer, making it appear brighter than it truly was. I paused, feeling a tremor of fatigue in my wrist, the kind that comes from hours of repetitive motion. Sweat slid down my back beneath my shirt, mixing with the sharp scent of drying paint. It was the first time I felt seen, not as someone's daughter-in-law, but as the person actually doing the work. The house looked a little less tired each day, a little more like a place someone cared about. I didn't tell anyone how I stayed up the previous night comparing prices, watching tutorials, and marking measurements. Those details stayed tucked behind my steady nod whenever someone complimented the progress. I wasn't doing it for praise anyway. I was doing it because fixing things felt like forward motion. I paid every contractor's invoice myself, using my own card, matching each charge on the statement with the line item in my spreadsheet. I kept the receipts crisp, ungapped, uncreased, as if preserving them in near-perfect condition could also preserve the fairness I believed existed between us. Whenever the contractors asked who the homeowner was, I pointed toward the house and simply said, "Family." That answer seemed to satisfy them. I annotated each payment: roofing deposit, electrical rewiring, plumbing replacement, moisture protection. I added the phrase capital improvement beside the larger costs, not out of legal foresight, but because it felt true. These weren't decorative whims. They were the bones of the house being reset and strengthened. I didn't realize then how important those distinctions would become. I only knew that each transaction made the place safer, sturdier, more habitable, for all of us. Before every major repair, I photographed the room from multiple angles: the peeling paint, the water stains, the warped flooring. I took the photos quickly at first, but over time I grew methodical. Same angles, same lighting, same framing, like documenting a long medical procedure. The before and after sets felt satisfying, almost reassuring, as if proof could anchor the truth better than memory. The scent of fresh paint mixing with new lumber gave the house an unfamiliar brightness, and I sometimes stood in the doorway just to feel it wash over me. I organized the photos into folders labeled by project and tucked them beside the receipts. It felt like creating a structure within a structure, a quiet scaffolding beneath all the effort. I didn't say it aloud, but I liked the sense of order. It made the future feel less fragile. I believed, fully and simply, that this house would be our long-term home. Hers, mine, my child's. I let myself imagine birthdays here, holidays, arguments followed by reconciliations in the kitchen, the kind of ordinary domestic life that turns a structure into a story. I didn't push for my name on anything. I didn't ask for written agreements. I let the trust sit between us like a shared quilt, warm enough if no one tugged too hard. The repairs felt like an investment in stability, in roots, in the quiet confidence of belonging. I didn't realize how vulnerable that belief made me, or how much it would later cost to unlearn it. For now I just breathed, looked at the newly sealed windows and told myself, this is home. The phrase "your home" began appearing more often, casually dropped at dinner, folded into small moments, offered the way someone offers a napkin or a refill of water. My mother-in-law would lift her bowl, glance at the freshly painted wall behind me and say, "You have such a good eye." Her voice carried a thin ribbon of admiration, wrapped loosely around something unspoken. Each time she said it, the words hit the same place inside me, a soft, hopeful spot that wanted to believe her. I took the compliment the way I took most things back then, quietly, gratefully, believing it meant more than it did. She didn't see how the house still smelled faintly of primer on humid nights. She didn't notice how my hands stayed stained along the cuticles from sanding the porch steps. She just saw the transformation and spoke to me as if that transformation made the place mine. I let the words settle without questioning the boundaries they blurred. When I signed the contract for the electricians to replace the entire system, it felt like choosing safety over hesitation. The original wiring had been fragile, stiff, and one bad spark away from disaster. The contractor showed me the burnt insulation inside a wall cavity, and the smell, acrid and metallic, stayed with me long after he left. The new wiring clicked softly when tested, each switch sounding like a small promise. I approved the work without asking her first, believing my judgment aligned with hers. It didn't occur to me that I was taking on responsibilities no one had formally handed me. I only saw the house as a patient needing treatment, and I had the means to provide it. The logic felt clean, even comforting. I didn't realize then how easily clarity can be mistaken for consent. I built a monthly cost summary on my laptop, a neat grid of expenses grouped by repair type. Numbers lined up as orderly as soldiers in formation, dates, amounts, vendor names. The spreadsheet gave shape to what my body felt every day. The tiredness in my arms, the quiet pride after finishing a task, the relief of patching another vulnerability in the house. Watching the columns expand felt oddly satisfying, like progress, measured in both structure and discipline. It wasn't about money. It was about accountability to the work itself. I updated it late at night when the house was silent, the glow of the screen reflecting in the window beside me. I didn't share the document with anyone. It was just a way to keep track of the life we were building, or the life I thought we were building. She liked telling relatives, "The house is fully upgraded now," her voice bright with pride. I would be in the kitchen rinsing paint from under my nails, listening to her recount the improvements, as if she had been the one calling contractors, comparing estimates, or crawling under the sink to assess the leak. I didn't mind. I told myself family pride was collective pride, and her joy felt like proof that my work held value. Sometimes, I caught her cousins glancing around the rooms, impressed by the clean lines and fresh colors. I stood in the background, hands damp from the sink, letting the satisfaction settle quietly inside me. I didn't need applause. The house itself felt like acknowledgement enough. I never asked about the deed, never brought up the legalities of ownership or the distribution of responsibility. Back then, silence felt synonymous with trust. I believed that if I kept doing good, honest work, the relationship would naturally align around fairness. I didn't want to seem transactional or calculating. I didn't want to turn a home into a negotiation table. So I kept my questions folded tightly inside me, between the receipts in my folder and the pages of my planner. I thought avoiding the conversation was a sign of respect. Later, I would learn that unanswered questions don't disappear. They accumulate weight. One night, after logging my latest receipts, I wrote a small note in the margin of my spreadsheet. Ownership? The single word hovered awkwardly among the numbers, out of place and a little too honest. I stared at it for a long moment before closing the laptop. The house hummed softly around me, repaired wiring, sealed windows, reinforced roof, but something else buzzed beneath the quiet, a faint unease, barely formed but persistent. I brushed it aside, told myself it was nothing, and turned off the light. At the time, I didn't know that questions whispered once would someday need to be answered loudly. When the divorce papers were finalized, the silence in the house shifted. It felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I packed slowly, folding clothes into a single suitcase, each motion deliberate, almost ceremonial. The zipper scraped across the metal teeth with a dry, decisive sound that cut through the kitchen air like a blade. I paused, hand resting on the handle, feeling the finality of it. My daughter's drawings were still stuck to the fridge, her shoes by the door, reminders of a life that had begun here, inside these repaired walls. I tried not to look too long at anything. I told myself I'd return for the rest once emotions settled, once conversations cooled. The house didn't echo yet, but it felt close, like it was preparing to. I lifted the suitcase upright, hearing its wheels knock softly against the hardwood floors I had refinished. There was something painfully ironic about leaving a home in better condition than when I entered it. My mother-in-law waited in the living room, her posture stiff, hands clasped tightly as if bracing for a storm she'd already chosen to start. "The house is mine," she said without preface. "Everything inside it is mine as well." Her tone was flat, stripped of the warmth she used to wrap around her words like a polite ribbon. The air dropped a degree, and the room seemed to narrow. I felt the strap of the suitcase dig into my palm as if reminding me to hold on to something. I looked at her carefully, searching for hesitation, for the faint quiver of uncertainty that might soften the blow. But her face remained steady, almost rehearsed. It wasn't anger that struck me first, it was disbelief. All the nights spent repainting walls, researching contractors, lifting damp boards from the porch, suddenly all of it felt like a story she was erasing with one sentence. I swallowed slowly, letting the truth settle piece by sharp piece. I placed the folder on the table with a steady hand, the weight of it settling into the wood like a declaration. I opened it carefully, letting the pages fan out, receipts, contracts, inspection notes, time-stamped photos. "These are the improvements I paid for," I said, my voice even. "Every structural repair, every material, every labor charge." The documents lay there without emotion, but they felt louder than either of us. She glanced at them, her eyes skimming quickly, as if hoping they would dissolve before she had to face what they represented. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I simply presented the facts, the way one might present medical records. Precise, unemotional, unavoidable. The house around us felt suddenly smaller, contained within the margins of each printed page. For the first time, I realized how much truth could occupy such thin sheets of paper. Her response wasn't words at first, it was a small, unfamiliar sound. The tap of her pen against the table twice, then silence. A gesture that felt pulled from instinct rather than intent, like she was trying to locate her footing. She didn't look at me. She stared at the top sheet as if the numbers were a foreign language. In that quiet beat, something flickered across her expression. Not regret, not apology, but a recognition she wasn't ready to name. I held my breath, waiting to see what shape her next sentence would take. The moment stretched long enough to feel like a pause in the lighting of the room, as if the house itself were waiting for her to speak. When she finally lifted her gaze, the tension between us felt carved into the air. "You did this voluntarily," she said. "Consider it a gift." Her voice regained its firmness, anchoring itself in an argument she must have practiced. I shook my head slowly. "I increased the value of your property," I replied. "That's not a gift. That's an investment." The words came out calm, stripped clean of emotion, but beneath them lay months of sweat, late-night planning, and a belief in shared responsibility. She stiffened, drawing back slightly as if my response had shifted the ground between us. Outside the window, the repaired porch glowed faintly beneath the afternoon light, the paint still new enough to reflect the sun. I wondered if she'd ever stepped outside and really looked at it, not as decoration, but as restored structure. Neither of us touched the glass of water sitting in the center of the table. It had tiny bubbles clinging to the sides, rising and bursting quietly, as if echoing the conversation unraveling between us. The stillness felt fragile, suspended between accusation and truth. I watched the condensation slide down the glass, collecting at the base, forming a thin ring. It reminded me of all the circles we had walked around each other these past months. Unspoken expectations, assumed agreements, unacknowledged labor. I didn't say anything more. She didn't either. The silence pressed down on both of us, not with finality, but with the weight of an unfolding truth neither could escape anymore. Her attorney was the first to recast my work as something trivial. On the phone, his voice carried that polished detachment lawyers use when they think they've already won. He called the repairs decorative improvements, as if replacing an entire electrical system were the same as buying throw pillows. I sat at my dining table, the one I'd sanded down myself, and ran my finger across the invoice for the new wiring. The contractor had written in bold letters, "Full system replacement." There was nothing decorative about the smell of burning insulation the day we discovered the faulty wires. Nothing superficial about preventing a fire. But his tone suggested otherwise, reducing months of labor into something whimsical, almost indulgent. I let him finish speaking before ending the call. I didn't argue. Not yet. The truth was sitting in a folder a few inches from my hand. Steady and undeniable, even if he pretended not to see it. At our next meeting, I slid forward the roofing contract, the plumbing invoices, and the photos of exposed beams where water had been seeping in for years. These repairs have warranties, I said. They're structural. My voice didn't rise. It simply filled the room with the clarity of fact. She avoided my eyes, staring instead at the edges of the photographs, where the shadows of mold had once crept up the walls. The attorney thumbed through the pages with clinical indifference, pausing only to tap his pen. "Still could be considered home improvement," he murmured. I didn't correct him. The evidence already had. I watched him flip to the page showing the clogged plumbing lines I had paid to replace, the rust flaking off like scabs. If he wanted to call that decor, let him. His language didn't change the damage that had been repaired, or who had paid for it. Their main argument rested on one point: no written agreement between me and her. No contract, no promise, no expectation of reimbursement. Voluntary work is just that, voluntary, the attorney said. I sat back, letting the words drift between us like dust motes in stale air. He was right in one sense. I hadn't asked for anything in writing. I had trusted her, trusted the family, trusted the idea that good faith was enough. I had acted out of responsibility, not obligation. But the repairs weren't gifts. They were necessary, urgent, life-extending interventions on a house that would have continued to rot without them. I resisted the urge to defend myself emotionally. Instead, I kept my hands folded, my breathing steady, knowing there would be a time to respond, and that time wasn't now. After the meeting, I wrote a summary of everything discussed, each point listed with dates and direct quotations. Not out of spite, but out of precision. Documentation was the only ground I had left that couldn't shift under me. I typed carefully, noting who said what, when, and how. The facts sat neatly on the page, cool and unbothered by interpretation. I saved the file beside the others, labeling it with the same system I used for the receipts. Then I closed my laptop and let the stillness of the room settle around me. It wasn't anger that stirred in my chest, it was clarity. If they wanted to play semantics, I would answer with records. If they insisted the truth could be bent, I would show them it still had a spine. In the days that followed, she began walking through the house with a different expression, part suspicion, part unease, part something she didn't want to name. She paused in front of the new water heater, then lingered by the reinforced beams near the entryway. Her eyes moved quickly, as though she was mentally cataloging everything she hadn't expected to be confronted with. I watched from a distance as she touched the curtains I'd chosen, hesitating for a moment before pulling her hand back. It was the first time I sensed she understood the gravity of the work I'd done, though she still wouldn't admit it aloud. Her silence held a tension I couldn't quite decipher, a mix of pride, fear, and the dawning awareness that the narrative she wanted to build didn't align neatly with the evidence in front of her. That was when I made the decision to stop handling the situation emotionally and start addressing it legally, not with threats or arguments, but with structure. Deadlines, summaries, documented exchanges. No feelings, I told myself quietly, only terms. It wasn't coldness, it was survival. The house had taught me the value of reinforcement, of strengthening weak points before they collapsed under pressure. This situation was no different. I gathered my folder, straightened the pages, and breathed slowly through the weight of what came next. Facts would carry me forward. Emotion would only anchor me to a place I no longer trusted. I spent an entire weekend digitizing every receipt. The living room floor disappeared beneath neat stacks of paper, each pile representing a different repair. Roof, wiring, plumbing, ceiling, hardware. I scanned them one by one, the soft hum of the machine becoming a kind of metronome that slowed my breathing. The files appeared on my screen with crisp names: vendor, date, amount, lined up in alphabetical order inside a folder that felt more dependable than any handshake I had ever received. The order calmed me. I wasn't preparing for battle. I was building clarity. Every document was a snapshot of truth, immutable and quiet. When I placed the papers back into their physical binder, the pages lay flat and obedient, as if acknowledging they were now backed by their digital shadows. I felt something settle inside me. Not rage, not fear, but steadiness. To avoid any ambiguity, I categorized the expenses into two columns: structural improvements and aesthetic choices. The structural column swelled quickly: new wiring, roof reinforcement, plumbing replacement, moisture barriers. The aesthetic column remained almost empty: a light fixture, a curtain rod, a can of paint for one accent wall I'd done on a whim. The distinction wasn't just practical, it was moral. I needed the truth to be undeniable, not only to them, but to myself. When I looked at the completed breakdown, the imbalance between the two categories was stark. The repairs weren't decoration, they were survival measures. I saved the breakdown into multiple folders and backed it up on an external drive, as if preparing for the possibility that someone might try to erase what was already real. I matched each receipt with photos taken before and after the repairs. Same angles, same lighting, same framing. I arranged them on the screen. Left side, damage. Right side, restoration. The comparisons were almost unsettling. You could see where water stains had crawled across the ceiling like veins, where old wiring had charred the inside of a wall, where the porch boards had bowed under years of neglect. On the right side, everything stood straighter, cleaner, safer. I labeled each pair carefully, cross-referencing them with the invoices. When I printed the sets and slid them into the binder, the pages felt heavier than they looked. Evidence has weight, not in ounces, but in the quiet authority it carries. I ran my hand over the page protectors and closed the binder with a soft press of my palm. Numbers alone weren't enough, so I created a depreciation schedule for the repairs, a chart showing each improvement's lifespan, cost, and the financial benefit it added to the property. Then I added a replacement value table, listing what it would cost to redo every upgrade if left undone until now. The totals painted a picture sharper than any argument I could make. I wasn't embellishing, I was quantifying reality. I attached the tables to the binder, hole-punched and aligned, the columns straight as iron bars. The more I documented, the less room there was for distortion. Each figure stood like a witness, unwavering, unbiased. I gathered statements from 2 neighbors and the lead contractor. Both neighbors confirmed they'd seen me coordinating the repairs, ordering materials, directing workers, paying invoices. The contractor provided a short letter stating I was the sole payer and decision-maker for the structural upgrades. Their words weren't emotional, they were factual, the kind of testimony that doesn't waver under scrutiny. I added each statement to the binder, sliding the pages into their sleeves. The binder thickened, the spines straining slightly, as if absorbing the collective truth of everyone who had watched the work unfold. At night, I practiced my presentation in front of the bathroom mirror, timing myself with the stopwatch on my phone. 90 seconds. Clear, direct, structured. Enough to state the facts without giving emotion room to hijack the narrative. I repeated the words until they stopped trembling, until they felt like part of my breathing. I invested in structural improvements. I paid in full. The benefit remains with the owner. The sentences landed with quiet precision. When I finally closed the binder and set it on the table, its presence filled the room like a pulse. I knew I wasn't done, but for the first time, I felt ready. I sat in a small community legal clinic, the fluorescent lights humming overhead with the same tired persistence as the questions circling my mind. A paralegal, calm, composed, deliberate, listened as I laid out the repairs, the payments, the conflict. When I finished, she linked her fingers thoughtfully and said two terms I had only seen in articles, but never imagined applying to my own life: unjust enrichment and quantum meruit. The words sounded almost academic, but she explained them plainly. If someone benefits from your work without compensation, the law can intervene. It wasn't revenge, it was equity. As she spoke, something inside me steadied. Not triumph, just recognition. I wasn't asking for anything extravagant. I was asking to be made whole again. She handed me a template for a demand letter, her voice soft but firm. "Facts win quietly," she said. I nodded, letting the truth of that settle deeper than any emotion I'd been carrying. Drafting the letter felt strangely empowering. I listed each structural repair: roof, wiring, plumbing, reinforcement, and the exact amounts paid. No embellishments, no dramatic language, just clean lines of fact. At the end, I summarized the total, $75,000. Seeing the number typed out felt different from watching receipts accumulate one by one. It was the full weight of my contribution distilled into a single figure. I added a note specifying the legal basis for reimbursement, referencing the doctrines the paralegal had mentioned. Writing the letter wasn't cathartic, it was clinical, necessary. Acknowledgement written in the language of accountability rather than apology. I printed 3 copies, the paper warm from the machine, edges straight, untouched by anything but clarity. Deadlines were essential, they had said, so I included one. A clear date by which I expected a response, along with the certified mail tracking number and the contact information for all communication. No phone calls, no hallway conversations, no what-ifs whispered in kitchens. I wanted everything in writing, solid and traceable. I had learned the hard way that verbal commitments dissolve far too easily, like steam rising from a pot left on low heat. As I reviewed the letter, I felt a strange calm settle into my ribs. This wasn't aggression, it was structure, the kind that protects rather than provokes. I sealed the envelope, smoothing the flap until it adhered perfectly. Later that evening, my best friend texted, "Aren't you worried they'll call you greedy?" I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "I'm more worried my daughter will learn to stay silent when she deserves fairness." Hitting send felt like exhaling something I'd held for too long. It wasn't about money anymore, it hadn't been for a while. It was about showing my child that dignity is a boundary worth defending, quietly, firmly, without apology. I set the phone down and returned to the binder, checking each section the way someone checks locks before leaving the house at night. Not out of fear, but out of respect for what mattered. Before the mediation, I prepared 3 identical folders, one for them, one for the mediator, one for myself. I chose fresh covers, the kind that didn't bend too easily, and filled each with the documents in precise order. The pages slid in with a soft whisper, a sound that made me feel unexpectedly grounded. When I closed the covers, they stacked evenly, each one a reflection of the others. There was something reassuring about the symmetry. No one could claim anything had been hidden or altered. Truth, when organized, has a way of standing upright without much help. The date for mediation was confirmed in a short email, almost anticlimactic in its brevity. A location, a time, a room number. The facts of it felt cold, but not unfriendly. More like hospital instructions before a procedure. Necessary, factual, neutral. I sat alone at my dining table, the binder beside me,
the confirmation email glowing on my phone. I closed my eyes and let the stillness settle. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for articulation, for speaking plainly what had already been lived. When I opened my eyes again, the path ahead felt clearer than it had in months. I locked the front door for the last time, with the scent of fresh paint still lingering in the air. It clung to the walls the way a memory clings to a room, long after the people have gone. The key turned smoothly, too smoothly, for a door that had once jammed from swelling wood. But that had been one of the first things I fixed. I rested my hand on the slab of the door for a moment, feeling its coolness against my palm. Behind it were the rooms I had made safe, functional, quietly beautiful. As I stepped back, the weight of departure pressed against my ribs. You don't expect a place to feel different on your last day, but it does. The silence shifts, the corners watch. I let the breath leave my chest slowly, steadying myself for the emptiness that would follow. On the porch, I traced my fingers along the railing I had repainted, twice. Once to cover the old stains,
and again to get the exact finish right. The wood felt smoother than the day I'd sanded it, cooler than I remembered, as if it were already distancing itself. My suitcase rolled behind me, wheels bumping softly against the boards I had reinforced. The house stood there, unchanged, indifferent to my leaving. I looked up at the roof I'd paid to repair, the shingles catching the late afternoon light. It struck me how strange it was to pour so much of yourself into something that would not follow you when you walked away. I didn't linger, I simply let my hand fall, then stepped down onto the walkway with a quiet acceptance I didn't entirely feel. I paused at the edge of the yard and glanced back at the newly finished roofline. The angles were straight now, clean against the sky, free of the sagging dip that once signaled years of neglect. For a moment, I allowed myself to admire it, not as a homeowner, not even as a participant in a dispute, but as someone who had fixed what needed fixing. I thought of the nights spent researching contractors, comparing bids, asking for second opinions, work no one had seen, labor no one had acknowledged. I felt the familiar pull of regret, not for the effort itself, but for believing the effort meant belonging. Letting go of that belief felt heavier than any box I'd carried out of the house. Inside the folder waiting in my suitcase was the organized record of everything I had done. Photos, receipts, summaries, estimates. But right then, on the walkway, the only record that mattered was the sound of the front door clicking shut behind me earlier. It echoed in my memory with a finality that startled me. Not a slam, not a hesitant creak, just a clean, precise closing. A sound that said the house no longer held space for me, yet it didn't feel like loss. It felt like a truth finally spoken aloud. I turned away from the memory of that sound and started walking, the suitcase trailing behind with its soft, rhythmic thud. Later that night, in the temporary apartment I had rented, I spread the folder across a small dining table. The pages looked almost clinical under the overhead light. Sharp corners, straight lines, numbered tabs. I organized them again, though they were already perfect, flipping through the sections one by one. Roof, electrical, plumbing, exterior repairs, interior reinforcement. The familiar order settled my breathing. This wasn't nostalgia, it was preparation. A kind of quiet rehearsal for the truth I would soon have to lay bare in a room full of strangers. The walls around me hummed with the unfamiliar emptiness of new spaces, but the binder grounded me in something steady. When I closed the folder, my hand lingered on the cover. I let the house go in stages, first physically, now mentally. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a slow, measured release. The kind that comes when you finally stop trying to hold together something that was never built to hold you in return. The night outside was still, city lights flickering faintly against the blinds. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet wrap around me, and allowed a single thought to settle fully for the first time. Whatever came next, I wasn't walking into it empty-handed. I had the truth, arranged and waiting. I began Part 9 the way I approached every other stage of this conflict, with structure. I drafted a one-page summary, meant to stand on its own. Facts, law, request. 3 sections, cleanly separated, no wasted words. I wrote it as if someone who had never met me would need to understand months of repairs in 60 seconds. The challenge wasn't condensing the information. It was stripping it of the emotion that wanted to seep through every line. I typed slowly, anchoring each point to something verifiable. The house was not mentioned by name, only by state and condition. My contributions were documented, not narrated. When I printed the summary and placed it on the table beside the binder, the page felt oddly heavier than its thickness suggested. A distillation of months, a single sheet, speaking with the sharpness of many. Next, I built the financial breakdown. $75,000, divided into specific line items: roof, plumbing, electrical, structural ceiling. Nothing rounded, nothing approximate. Every figure had a matching receipt. I resisted the urge to soften the total or shave off a few expenses, the way people sometimes do to seem reasonable. Accuracy was reasonable. I wasn't negotiating against myself before the conversation even began. I checked the numbers twice, then a third time, letting the precision settle into my bones. The breakdown felt like a compass, an anchor in a process where emotions often disguise themselves as arguments. Here, nothing hid, everything aligned. I practiced my opening statement in front of the mirror. Not the emotional version, not the hurt one. The version built from clarity. "I'm not asking for the house," I recited. "I'm asking for reimbursement for structural improvements I paid for, and the property permanently retains." Saying the words aloud felt different than writing them. They carried weight when spoken, like they steadied the air itself. I adjusted my tone, lowering it slightly, correcting moments where my voice wanted to shake. By the 4th repetition, the words no longer trembled. They simply existed, factual and firm. I timed myself. 90 seconds, no more, no less. I sent short reminders to the people who had agreed to act as witnesses. If needed, 10 to 15 minutes of your time. Nothing elaborate. The neighbors responded promptly, confirming without hesitation. The contractor replied with a thumbs-up emoji and a short message, affirming he still had the original invoices on file. Their willingness reassured me. Not because I doubted them, but because it anchored me to the truth that my work hadn't unfolded in silence. People had seen. People remembered. Their presence, even optional, felt like a quiet reinforcement I didn't know I needed until that moment. I printed enlarged versions of the before and after photos, side-by-side comparisons in crisp color, rotten boards next to reinforced beams, frayed wires beside clean new conduits, a warped roofline replaced with a straight, safe structure. The images didn't exaggerate. They revealed. I leaned the prints against the wall, stepping back to study them from a distance. They told the story better than any argument ever could. When I slid them into the binder, the protective sleeves crinkled softly, a reminder that truth can be preserved as carefully as evidence. Finally, I placed 2 pens in my bag, one for them, one for me. A small, almost ceremonial gesture. I wasn't expecting an immediate agreement, but I believed in preparation. I believed in the kind of quiet readiness that doesn't announce itself but waits, steady and composed. As I set the pens beside the binder, I felt something shift inside me. Not confidence exactly, but alignment. Everything was in order. Every fact, every document, every word I would speak. I exhaled, long and deliberate, feeling the weight of the coming days settle without overwhelming me. Whatever happened next, I was ready. The folder had begun to show signs of use. The once sharp edges now felt softer under my fingers, the cover slightly bowed from the weight of the pages inside. When I lifted it, it didn't feel like paper anymore. It felt like a small archive, holding months of labor and the truth of every dollar I had spent. I sat at my table and ran my thumb along the spine, noticing how it resisted closing fully, as though the documentation itself had begun to push outward. Every time I opened it, the soft rustle of pages sounded like breaths, steady, layered, undeniable. I didn't add anything new at that moment. I just held it, allowing myself to acknowledge how far this folder had carried me. It wasn't just evidence. It was the quiet accumulation of my effort given form. I added a new set of documents that day. Independent estimates from a third-party contractor. Their report was neatly formatted, stamped, and bound at the top with a small brass fastener. It listed the replacement value of each repair, what it would cost someone else to redo all the work from scratch. Seeing the numbers affirmed something I already knew but had never articulated. I had not overspent. If anything, I had underpaid for what the house truly needed. I slid the report into the folder, its fresh pages contrasting against the older, more handled ones. The mix of textures told its own story, past decisions and present validation resting side by side. I examined the contractor signatures again, checking for clear dates, printed names, and license numbers. Each signature anchored the truth with a kind of finality that spoken words rarely achieve. I compared them with the invoices, making sure every timeline aligned. There was comfort in verifying the small details, the ink strokes, the date formats, the tiny marks from different pens. These weren't emotional artifacts, they were factual ones, the kind that can't be softened or reshaped by interpretation. Holding the papers up to the light, I traced the faint embossing of the licensing seal, its ridges catching on the pad of my thumb. Accuracy had become its own form of calm. Color-coded tabs marked each section now. Red for the roof, blue for electrical, yellow for plumbing, green for exterior reinforcement. The organization wasn't just for clarity. It was a way to remind myself that every category represented a part of the house I had made safer. The tabs peeked out like thin flags, guiding me through the narrative without needing explanation. When I flipped through them, the binder felt almost like a map, one I could navigate even in the dark. I closed it gently, noting how the tabs aligned perfectly, like pieces settling into their rightful place. Structure had a way of soothing the parts of me still unsettled. I added a final note to the binder, a single phrase printed on clean white paper. Benefit retained by owner. It wasn't an argument, it was a fact. Quiet, precise, irrefutable. I inserted the note behind the last set of receipts, letting it act as a closing line without fanfare. The folder accepted it easily, the added page making barely a difference to its weight, though it made a difference to me. It was the point everything circled back to, the truth under every invoice and photograph. I smoothed the page once, then closed the binder with slow care. Before putting the binder away, I whispered the amount aloud. 75,000. The number carried no tremor now, only clarity. Hearing it outside my head made it feel more real, like a stone placed gently on a scale. I repeated it once more, softer this time, letting the precision of the figure settle into the room. It didn't intimidate me anymore. It didn't feel inflated or emotional. It felt earned. I slid the folder back into my bag, the weight grounding me instead of burdening me. Whatever happened next, I knew this. Truth had mass, and I was ready to carry it. I sat at my dining table with a checklist in front of me, the kind printed in clean bullet points. 3 lines, 3 elements. Simple in appearance, heavy in implication. To prove my case, I needed to show enrichment, that it came at my expense and that allowing it to remain uncompensated would be unfair. I read the words quietly, letting each one settle. They didn't frighten me. They didn't embolden me either. They simply clarified the path I was already on. I placed the checklist beside my binder, aligning the edges until they matched. The simplicity of the structure grounded me. There was no room for theatrics, no need for raised voices, only alignment between fact and principle. And that, I realized, was enough. I connected each element of the checklist to the documents I had already gathered. The photos showed deterioration before the repairs. The receipt showed the payments. The letters from contractors confirmed who hired them. The comparison charts demonstrated the property's improved value. One by one, I matched evidence to requirement, like assembling a puzzle whose pieces had been waiting patiently in the drawer. Nothing needed embellishment. The facts stood on their own, unadorned and steady. I felt a quiet satisfaction as the structure emerged, clean, coherent, cohesive. The kind of clarity that doesn't need permission to exist. I anticipated the argument they would use, that my work had been voluntary, an act of goodwill, a gesture of family harmony. I wrote a small note beneath it, intent to gift cannot be assumed. That sentence wasn't emotional, it was factual. Repairs that restore functionality to a property aren't gifts, they're obligations that someone chose to fulfill. I listed the ways the improvements aligned with necessary maintenance, not personal taste. There was nothing sentimental about rewiring an entire electrical system or stopping water from leaking through a roof. I let the logic speak for itself, steady and unshakable. To further anchor the structure of my argument, I created a timeline. Each repair was placed on the line with date, cost, and the condition that prompted it. I positioned the divorce date near the end, not as a dramatic turn, but as a marker of context. The repairs had come long before the separation. They weren't part of a bargaining strategy or a last-minute favor. They were maintenance, responsibility, carried out in real time. When I stepped back and looked at the full timeline, the sequence was undeniable. It read like a quiet ledger of diligence. I built contingency options as well. If they contested the total, I could show replacement values. If they questioned necessity, I had photos of the damage. If they disputed my role, I had letters from witnesses. I added a final note at the end of the document. No discussion of character, only cost and benefit. It wasn't a shield against emotion, it was a boundary. A clear reminder that this wasn't personal. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about restoring balance. And balance, I knew, didn't require apology. I refined 2 clauses for the eventual agreement, one confirming no party was admitting fault, and another ensuring neither side would disparage the other going forward. These clauses weren't defenses, they were bridges, ways to close a chapter without leaving splinters behind. I pictured the signatures that would eventually sit beneath them, steady strokes acknowledging closure without demanding contrition. When I finished, I placed the documents back into the binder, easing the cover shut until it lay flat. The room around me felt still, almost contemplative. Preparation had given me something I hadn't expected: peace. The hallway outside the mediation room was lit by a single row of muted ceiling lamps, their glow stretching across the carpet in long, quiet bands. I arrived early, binder tucked against my ribs, breathing evenly to keep my thoughts from scattering. When the mediator opened the door, the room felt colder than the hallway. Neutral colors, a round table, water pitchers no one had touched yet. I stepped in slowly, taking in the sterile calm. It reminded me of a waiting room before a medical procedure, the kind where you steady yourself by focusing on what you can control. "I'm not here for the house," I said when invited to speak first. "I'm here for fairness." The mediator nodded once, acknowledging the clarity of the sentence. I sat down, folding my hands gently on the table, grounding myself in the stillness. My mother-in-law entered a moment later, her steps careful, almost hesitant. She carried no binder, no papers, only a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there months before. She took the seat opposite mine, her eyes flicking briefly toward the walls as though searching for an escape route. The mediator offered a polite greeting, explaining the process in clipped, neutral sentences. I watched her posture shift, shoulders rising, then settling, but not relaxing. It struck me that this was the first time we were facing each other without a kitchen table or a living room between us. No home environment to soften the conversation, no family backdrop to blur the lines. Just the three of us, and a room designed to hold truth without decoration. When the mediator invited me to begin, I placed the binder on the table and slid it forward, page edges aligned, tabs visible in their neat rows. I kept my voice low and steady as I explained the repairs. The wiring replaced for safety, the roof reinforced to prevent collapse, the plumbing restored from years of neglect. I stated them the way a doctor states symptoms, without embellishment, without anger, without anything that could cloud the facts. "These are structural improvements," I said, "paid fully, documented thoroughly, and permanently retained by the property." The mediator nodded slowly, reviewing the visible tabs before turning his attention to her. The room stayed silent, the kind of silence that holds more weight than sound. A warm beam of overhead light cast itself across the binder's cover, highlighting the surface in a soft, reflective sheen. For a moment, the folder appeared almost illuminated, its edges catching the glow like a quiet signal of everything contained inside. I didn't reach for it. I let the moment speak on its own. The mediator adjusted his glasses, and even he seemed momentarily paused by the neatness of it all. The precision of the organization, the coherence of the evidence. To me, it felt like watching truth settle visibly into the room, not loudly, but undeniably. A presence rather than an argument. My mother-in-law stared at the tabletop, her gaze darting every few seconds to the curtains near the window, as though looking at anything else might offer a softer version of the moment. There was something fleeting in her expression, uncertainty maybe, or a realization that the narrative she'd carried in her mind no longer fit the arrangement of facts in front of her. She pressed her fingertips together, a small gesture that revealed more than words might have. The mediator invited her to respond, but she hesitated. For the first time, I saw not defiance, but discomfort. Not hostility, but avoidance. It softened something in me. Not enough to undo the months behind us, but enough to recognize her humanity in the tension. When it was my turn to continue, I spoke slowly, aware of every breath. "I'm not angry," I said. "I just want reimbursement for the work I paid for." The mediator took notes, nodding for me to go on. But there was nothing else to add. Everything that needed saying was already in the binder. Everything that needed proving had already been proven. I leaned back slightly, letting silence fill the room again. This wasn't a performance, it wasn't a confrontation. It was a clarification. One delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had carried the truth long enough to no longer fear speaking it aloud. I laid out the summary sheets the way one might set instruments on a surgical tray, clean, aligned, ready for use. The mediator passed copies to each side, the paper sliding across the table with a soft whisper. My mother-in-law accepted hers with a slight tremor in her fingers. And for a moment, I wondered if she expected pages filled with anger instead of neatly printed line items. Page 1 was the overview. Page 2 through 5 detailed each repair, what had been done, why it was necessary, and what it cost. I explained the structure in a quiet, even tone, the facts steady beneath my voice. The mediator followed along, eyes moving methodically from column to column. I didn't rush. I didn't soften anything. Truth doesn't need cushioning. It just needs room to stand. To clarify the difference between what I had repaired and what they claimed I had decorated, I used a simple example. Replacing an entire roof isn't the same thing as hanging a painting, I said. One prevents structural failure. The other is optional. The room held the comparison without argument. She shifted in her chair, gaze lowering toward the paperwork, as if the distinction had landed somewhere she hadn't prepared for. I kept my tone gentle but precise, not persuasive, not defensive, just exact. The kind of clarity that draws a quiet line down the center of a conversation and refuses to blur. I proposed the payment structure the same way I had built the repairs. Straightforward, no embellishment. One payment, cashier's check, I said. I can provide a specific date, time, and location. The mediator nodded approvingly, appreciating the simplicity. She looked up for the first time in minutes, her eyes flickering with something halfway between resistance and resignation. The idea of a single, final payment seemed to settle the room, shrinking the conflict into something tangible rather than emotional. I folded my hands calmly, giving the moment space to breathe. Structure had a way of disarming chaos, even when tension lingered beneath the surface. Throughout the session, I wrote my own notes by hand, documenting each statement exactly as spoken. Not to weaponize them later, but to honor the precision I'd built this entire process on. Her attorney made a few comments, careful but measured, and I wrote those down too. I didn't interpret, I didn't annotate with emotion, just transcribed. Words lose their sharpness when reshaped by memory, but on paper they stay honest. The act of writing steadied me, grounding my presence in the room. My pen moved at the pace of my breathing, slow, controlled, deliberate. At one point, the mediator excused us for a short break. I stepped into the hallway, took a small sip of water, and let my shoulders drop for the first time since arriving. When I returned, she was already seated, her expression quieter, less guarded. I mirrored that quiet. The room wasn't a battleground. It was a place to articulate what had already been lived. I took another small sip, felt the coolness settle, then placed my glass down with careful precision. I wasn't performing calm, I was practicing it. When the session paused again, I gathered my binder and stood. Not abruptly, not with finality, just a small shift of posture to release the tension in my legs. I stepped out for 10 minutes, breathing in the muted air of the hallway, letting the weight of the process settle. I didn't feel triumphant or discouraged. I felt aligned, steady within myself, anchored by the truth I had carried meticulously from the first receipt to this table. When I re-entered the room, the mediator nodded as if he sensed it too. Some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. They returned with their first offer at the start of the next session. $15,000, spoken plainly, almost casually, as if the number had been plucked from the air rather than drawn from any relationship to the work I had done. I stared at the figure written on the mediator's notepad, letting the silence stretch long enough to reveal its own imbalance. I didn't flinch. I didn't sigh. I simply allowed the stillness to settle between us. The mediator looked at me, waiting for a reaction. But there was nothing to react to. 15,000 wasn't an argument, it was an avoidance. I folded my hands together and let the moment stand exactly as it was. Insufficient, unanchored, unconvincing. When I responded, I didn't raise my voice or adjust my posture. I simply pointed to the section in the binder that listed the replacement values for the structural work. "This number doesn't reflect the benefit received," I said. My mother-in-law shifted, her gaze darting briefly toward the photographs of the roof and electrical system. The mediator reviewed the documents again, nodding slowly, recognizing the mismatch. I didn't try to persuade her. I didn't press the point. Facts, once placed on the table, don't need volume. They need only space. And space was exactly what the room gave them. I explained the consequences of allowing the benefit to remain uncompensated, not through accusation, but through logic. Unreturned value becomes inequity, I said, and inequity becomes precedent. The mediator wrote down my words, recognizing their weight. She didn't look at me, but she looked at the binder, and the binder had a way of holding the argument without emotional interference. The repairs weren't abstract. They were visible, photographed, verified. The cost of undoing them or redoing them was real. The property stood stronger because of them, and that strength wasn't something she could minimize into sentiment. I placed my counteroffer on the table, $75,000, the same total I had presented from the beginning. I added a deadline, not as pressure, but as structure. 7 days for consideration, I said. After that, I proceed formally. The sentence wasn't harsh or dramatic. It was a boundary, a clear, uncluttered line drawn from fairness to accountability. The mediator nodded again, appreciating the precision. She exhaled quietly, perhaps realizing that this wasn't a negotiation based on emotion, but one built on arithmetic and integrity. When her attorney attempted to shift the discussion toward character, my intentions, my decisions, my supposed generosity, I stopped him gently. "This is not about personality," I said. "We are talking about cost and value." The simplicity of the distinction disarmed the room. He closed his folder, perhaps realizing that argument wouldn't find footing here. My mother-in-law's shoulders slumped slightly, her resistance softening into something quieter. Fatigue, maybe, or the awareness that the conversation had moved beyond her preferred framing. I didn't meet her eyes. I didn't look away either. I stayed exactly where the truth lived. They asked for a pause. The mediator agreed, stepping out to give them space. The air in the room eased as soon as the door closed, as if the tension had thinned enough to breathe again. I remained seated, hands still, gaze steady on the binder in front of me. I felt neither victory nor frustration, only clarity. Their offer had been low, not because the value was low, but because denial often tries to disguise itself as negotiation. I let the thought pass through me, calm and unbothered. The truth didn't need adjusting. It only needed time to be recognized. During the next session, the folder slipped slightly toward the edge of the table as I set down my pen. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle shift, a quiet slide of smooth plastic against polished wood. I caught it with my fingertips, steadying it before it could fall. The motion was instinctive, almost tender, as if I were straightening something that deserved care. I nudged the spine back into alignment, smoothing the edges until they lay parallel with the table's grain. The mediator glanced at the movement, then at me, reading more in the gesture than I intended. I wasn't clinging to the folder, I was respecting it. Months of truth lived inside those pages, organized, verified, and waiting. Every time I touched it, I felt a steadiness settle behind my ribs. Not anger, not defiance, just certainty. To re-establish clarity, I placed a brief call to one of the neighbors who had offered to confirm my role in coordinating the repairs. I put the phone on speaker for the mediator to hear. The neighbor's voice was calm, almost casual. "Yes, she paid for everything. Yes, she supervised the work. We saw it. It wasn't emotional testimony, just memory stated plainly. The contractor, reached separately, echoed the same. Invoices paid by me, decisions made by me, instructions given by me. Their statements aligned so consistently that the mediator simply nodded and wrote a single line in her notes. There was nothing left to interpret. The truth had witnesses. I handed over a letter from the electrician, verifying that the entire wiring system had been replaced under my direction. His handwriting was steady, the signature unmistakably his, the license number clear. The mediator read it carefully, scanning the dates and cross-referencing them with the earlier receipts. This would have been a safety issue if left unrepaired, she murmured. My mother-in-law's attorney shifted uncomfortably. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The letter explained more in its careful sentences than any argument could. It wasn't about emotion. It was about safety, necessity, and the responsibility someone had taken when no one else did. After reviewing the documents again, I issued the formal request. $75,000. Not inflated, not rounded. Simply the total cost of the structural improvements I had made. I stated it with the same calm I had practiced in the mirror, steady, unshaken. The mediator nodded, acknowledging the legitimacy of the figure. My mother-in-law looked down at the table, her fingers tightening around her pen. The request wasn't new, it wasn't surprising. But hearing it stated plainly, with no room for dismissal, seemed to land differently. I kept my gaze neutral, centered on the papers before me. The number was not a threat, it was a record. To maintain the integrity of the process, I reiterated one condition. Neither side would disparage the other, now or moving forward. The mediator marked the point with a small star in her notes. This keeps the resolution clean, I said. She agreed. My mother-in-law didn't speak, but her posture softened. Not in acceptance, but in the recognition that fairness had boundaries. We weren't here to burn bridges. We were here to close a chapter with dignity. The request was simple. Truth without hostility. Closure without aftermath. At the end of the session, I placed a blank cashier's check slip on the table. Not filled out, just present. Not a provocation, but an invitation for resolution. The mediator glanced at it with quiet approval. My mother-in-law's eyes lingered on it a second longer, the reality of the process settling into her features. I placed my pen beside it, matching its angle precisely. Then I leaned back, breathing with slow control. The room felt balanced, almost weightless. Whatever happened next, the path forward was clear. The decision was now theirs, not mine. I spent the next morning assembling the notice of intent to file, slipping each exhibit into place with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The envelope grew thick quickly, pages layered with dates, signatures, invoices, and photographs. When I sealed it, the flap pressed down with a faint, adhesive crackle, the kind of sound that marks a shift from conversation to consequence. I wrote the address in careful print, each letter formed cleanly, then placed the envelope on the center of my table. It looked almost clinical there, a quiet correction waiting to be delivered. I didn't feel triumphant or vindictive. I felt procedural. The kind of steadiness that comes from knowing the next step isn't emotional, it's structural. A necessary progression in a sequence already set in motion. At the post office, I requested certified mail with tracking, watching the clerk attach a long strip of barcode numbers to the top of the envelope. The label curled slightly at the edge before settling flat, as if even the paperwork needed a moment to accept its new purpose. I held the slip between my fingers afterward, the numbers sharp against the thin paper. It felt like holding a thread, long, taut, connecting 2 points with perfect clarity. Once the envelope disappeared into the outgoing bin, a subtle weight lifted from my chest. The process had moved forward. The line between us had become official, documented, traceable. I sent follow-up emails after every interaction, summarizing calls in precise bullet points. No interpretation, no assumptions. Just timestamps, statements, and confirmations. Each email was a way of clearing the fog around the situation, replacing ambiguity with record. I learned to type them calmly, almost meditatively, letting the cursor blink against the screen before moving to the next sentence. It felt like stitching fabric, small, consistent motions reinforcing something larger. The responses were short, sometimes curt, but they were written, and that was enough. Words on paper have a permanence conversations never offer. I set reminders on my phone for every deadline, not because I doubted myself, but because structure steadied me. Each alert was like a soft tap on the shoulder, a quiet reminder that fairness wasn't spontaneous. It was scheduled. I created a timeline on my wall, marking the dates in black ink, the lines between them straight and intentional. It wasn't anger that fueled me, it was clarity. When systems fail people who trust too easily, procedure becomes a form of protection. And protection, I'd learned, doesn't have to be loud. A friend sent me a small heart emoji one afternoon, as if offering a warmth that procedure could never provide. I smiled faintly and typed back, "I'm okay, truly." And I meant it. The emotions that once tangled inside me had settled into something quieter, something steadier. I no longer replayed conversations in my head or wondered if I should have spoken differently. The binder spoke for me now. The documents carried the weight. My job was simply to move through each step, one measured action at a time. That night I turned off my phone earlier than usual. I let the room grow dim around me, the quiet settling over my shoulders like a soft blanket. Tomorrow would bring more decisions, more emails, more structure. But tonight was for rest. I lay down, feeling the tension lift slowly, and allowed myself to drift. Not into hope, not into fear, just into stillness. The kind that comes when you've done everything you can, and the next step no longer belongs to feeling, but to fact. When they returned for the second negotiation, their offer had risen to $30,000. The mediator delivered the number with a neutral tone, as if reading a temperature or reporting cloud cover. I looked at the figure in silence, letting it settle the way you let a truth sink before responding. It wasn't insulting, not like the first offer, but it wasn't aligned with reality either. I folded my hands loosely on the table, studying their expression. Her attorney sat straighter, arms crossed, as if $30,000 were a concession of remarkable generosity. My mother-in-law's eyes flickered toward mine and then away, a small, telling movement. I didn't feel disappointment or anger, only clarity. $30,000 might have sounded large to them. To me, it was a partial truth trying to masquerade as fairness. I suggested bringing in an independent appraiser for a neutral evaluation, someone with no connection, no bias, no shared history. A third-party assessment will anchor the numbers, I said. The mediator nodded, understanding the intent. Her attorney hesitated, perhaps aware that an unbiased assessment would eliminate any room for shaping the narrative. My mother-in-law pressed her fingers together, staring at the tabletop as if it might offer an easier version of the truth. I didn't push. The offer itself wasn't the point, the accuracy was. And accuracy survives scrutiny. That's why I welcomed it. I presented a comparison sheet showing the current replacement cost of each repair. 2 columns rested side by side, actual cost and replacement value. The difference was undeniable. Labor had increased, materials had risen sharply. Had I postponed the repairs, the totals would be even higher today. I let the numbers speak, the way clear evidence always does. The mediator leaned in slightly, scanning the figures, his fingertips resting lightly on the table. My mother-in-law's attorney shifted again, quieter this time. The sheet revealed what polite conversations could not, the truth in arithmetic form. I held firm. 75,000. Not out of stubbornness, but because that was the actual amount. Not inflated, not rounded, just true. This is the minimum fair figure, I said, my voice level, unbruised. The mediator nodded as he wrote it down. My mother-in-law looked at the papers, then at her hands, as if measuring something only she could feel. I didn't fill the air with explanation. Silence has its own strength when the facts are already present. Holding steady wasn't combative, it was consistent. And consistency, I'd learned, is a form of integrity. She glanced at the curtains across the room, the ones she had fixated on during earlier sessions. Something softened in her expression. Not exactly regret, but a recognition that fought quietly beneath her composed exterior. Her attorney leaned toward her, whispering something she didn't fully register. For the first time, I sensed the shift. Not a change of heart, but the collapse of a narrative she had tried to sustain. Facts have a way of doing that. They erase the versions of events people prefer and replace them with what actually happened. I didn't gloat. I didn't even smile. I simply watched the softening with a quiet, human understanding. The mediator scheduled one final session, his tone measured and decisive. "Next time, we close," he said. The afternoon light slipped across the room as we packed our papers. My mother-in-law gathered her purse slowly, her movements less rigid than before. I slid the binder into my bag, feeling its familiar weight settle against my side. Not heavy, just present. As we stepped into the hallway, no one spoke. The silence wasn't strained anymore. It carried a sense of inevitability, like the final steps in a long journey where the destination had been visible for some time. I breathed in, steady and calm. The end was approaching, and all that remained was truth. By the final round of discussion, they tried narrowing the scope of what counted toward reimbursement. Some of these, her attorney said, tapping the edge of the binder, lean more toward optional improvements. I watched his finger hover over the categories he hoped would shrink the total: paint, fixtures, small materials, then drift dangerously close to the structural items, as if hoping proximity might erase their importance. I didn't interrupt. I waited until he paused, then calmly redirected his attention to the correct sections. "These items aren't decor," I said. "They're structural necessities." My voice was steady, my posture relaxed, but each word was exact, the way a measuring tool clicks into place when aligned correctly. He hesitated, then withdrew his hand. The distinction was no longer up for reinterpretation. I pointed to the pages documenting the electrical work, plumbing repairs, roof reinforcement, and the safety measures required to bring the home into basic compliance. "These make the property habitable," I said. "They're not preferences." The mediator reviewed the documents again, nodding. I could see the argument weaken on my mother-in-law's face, not because she agreed, but because the technical necessity couldn't be softened into opinion. Safety doesn't negotiate. A faulty wire doesn't care about anyone's version of generosity. A leaking pipe doesn't adhere to family narratives. The papers on the table reflected those truths so plainly that any attempt to recast them felt increasingly thin. I provided side-by-side photographs, same room, same angle, same light, showing the before and after of every major fix. Rotting beams, mold creeping along baseboards, warped floorboards, frayed insulation. Then the repaired versions, reinforced, sealed, rewired, restored. I slid each set forward, letting the images state what words would only dilute. The mediator studied them closely, his pen motionless for the first time in the session. Even her attorney leaned in, the visual evidence pulling him out of his argument and into the reality of what had been repaired. I didn't add commentary. Truth doesn't require narration when it is visible in full color. Whenever a statement drifted into speculation or selective memory, I wrote it down, then clarified it by email afterward. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was collecting accuracy. And accuracy has a certain gravity. I summarized each conversation the same afternoon it occurred, sending clean, organized notes that left no room for misunderstanding. It was routine by then, almost meditative. Document, summarize, file. The practice didn't harden me, It steadied me. If anyone questioned what had been said, the record was there, quiet and factual. In a process where emotion tried to rewrite the past, written clarity became my anchor. Throughout the session, I never commented on character, not mine, not hers. I kept the focus on value, cost, necessity, and fairness. "This is about the property," I said once, gently interrupting her attorney as he veered into personal territory. The room stilled. The mediator nodded, acknowledging the boundary. Even my mother-in-law seemed to recognize the shift, folding her hands as if accepting that the discussion had outgrown emotional framing. Arguments built on sentiment evaporate quickly. Arguments built on fact remain. And in that room, only one kind still held weight. I limited all communication to formal channels, emails copied to the mediator, calls logged by time and date. No offhand messages or side conversations. Not out of distance, but out of respect for the process. Clarity thrives within structure. Anything outside it risks becoming noise. As the session neared its end, I gathered my binder, ensuring each page rested squarely inside its sleeve. I felt no adrenaline, no trembling, only a quiet readiness. Whatever came in the final negotiation, the groundwork was complete. The truth was fully assembled, organized and present, unshaken by pressure, untouched by interpretation. The mediator opened the last negotiation with a quiet proposal. He suggested a range, 60 to 80,000, as the space where a resolution could live. His tone wasn't persuasive or directive. It was observational, like someone naming the weather. I listened without shifting in my seat. The number didn't surprise me. It reflected what had been visible for weeks. The evidence had shaped the parameters more than anyone's preference. My mother-in-law looked at the suggestion with a tension that flickered across her features, a small contraction at the corner of her mouth. Her attorney tapped his pen once, then stilled it. No one rejected the range outright. It hovered in the room like a door quietly ajar. I let the silence sit, absorbing the weight of possibility without rushing toward it. When it was my turn, I anchored my position clearly. 75,000, I said, along with a clause confirming no admission of fault. My voice didn't waver. I wasn't asking for justification or acknowledgement, only the terms needed to close the chapter cleanly. The mediator nodded, appreciative of the precision. My mother-in-law blinked slowly, her gaze dropping to the table as if following the line of my reasoning, downward into something she could finally see. The clause mattered. It protected both of us. It removed the emotional sting people fear when conceding ground. It let fairness exist without theatrics. I clarified the method of payment next. A single cashier's check, complete, no installments. One exchange, one conclusion. I provided a date that allowed enough time for preparation, but not enough for delay. The mediator wrote it down, his pen moving with a sense of final coordination. Her attorney nodded, slowly at first, then with incremental confidence as he reviewed the numbers again. My mother-in-law's breathing shifted, a small, nearly imperceptible exhale, like someone realizing the inevitable wasn't a threat, but a resolution, waiting to be accepted. I didn't look for her reaction. I simply held the space steady. We added another clause to the draft, a mutual agreement not to speak negatively about each other moving forward. It wasn't about image. It was about ensuring that whatever scars remained would not become open wounds. The mediator underscored the line twice, murmuring that it was a wise boundary. I agreed quietly. My mother-in-law surprised me by nodding as well, her chin dipping once with a kind of weary acceptance. The room softened slightly, as if the air recognized the shift from conflict to closure. I let the moment breathe. We were shaping the final edges of something that had been jagged for too long. I reviewed the draft carefully, reading each sentence with the same steadiness I used when examining invoices months earlier. Dates, amounts, names, signatures. Every detail carried weight. A single wrong letter could create an opening for dispute later, and I was determined to seal every seam. My pen traced each line, not marking anything yet, just traveling the text like a fingertip over a scar. When I finished, I adjusted one abbreviation, one date format, and one spacing issue. Small corrections, but significant. Precision wasn't a habit now, it was a safeguard. When the mediator printed the final draft for signatures, the pages slid from the machine warm and faintly curled at the edges. He placed them at the center of the table, the stack resting between us like a neutral shoreline. I nodded, signaling I was ready. My mother-in-law looked at the documents, then at me, just once, without hostility or deflection. Something settled in her shoulders, a release both quiet and palpable. The pen passed from the mediator's hand to hers, and then slowly to mine, each of us preparing to sign the ending we had built through truth, structure, and a long, necessary calm. She signed first. Her hand hovered for a moment above the line, the pen tip suspended as if listening for something inside her. Then, with a slow exhale, she pressed the ink to the page. The stroke wavered once, just enough to reveal the internal shift, the quiet surrender of a narrative she could no longer hold. Her eyes didn't rise, not even when the last letter curled toward its ending. The room felt muted, as though sound itself had stepped back to avoid intruding. Once she finished, she placed the pen down with a careful, almost delicate motion. For a brief second, she simply looked at her own signature, as if seeing it for what it was. Acknowledgement, closure, and a truth she hadn't intended to face. When it was my turn, I didn't hesitate. My hand moved with steadiness, the ink forming letters that felt both familiar and resolute. Signing didn't bring triumph. There was no rush of victory, no swell of vindication. What I felt was clarity, a line drawn cleanly across the months behind me. The mediator watched, his expression neutral but attentive, as if recognizing that a signature can sometimes be more than a formality. It can be a reclamation. When I finished, I lifted the pen and placed it beside hers, the two objects lying parallel, separated only by a few inches of wood grain that suddenly felt symbolic. The cashier's check was handed to me next, crisp, firm, the paper weight slightly heavier than ordinary stock. $75,000, written without embellishment. I examined it briefly, not to admire it, but to confirm accuracy. Then I scanned it using my phone, the confirmation screen reflecting softly against the table's surface. The digital copy joined the rest of my records, a final piece in a long architectural structure of truth. When I slid the check into my folder, it rested against the documents like the last tile in a mosaic built from months of diligence. The mediator distributed copies of the signed agreement, 3 folders, identical in weight and content, each representing a different path forward. I handed one to her attorney, who accepted it with a formal nod. My mother-in-law received hers more slowly, fingers brushing the edges with an uncertain gentleness. Perhaps she felt the weight of it. Perhaps she didn't. Closure isn't symmetrical. It arrives differently for everyone. When I tucked my own copy into my bag, the zipper glided smoothly, sealing the moment with an unspoken finality. The folder closed with a quiet sound, a soft, muted fold that felt like punctuation, not an exclamation, not a question, a period, simple and complete. I let my palm rest on the cover for a moment, acknowledging everything it had held. The work, the truth, the strain, the resilience. The mediator gathered his papers, offering a polite farewell. It wasn't celebratory. It wasn't somber. It was procedural, the way endings often are once the emotional weight has settled. I stood, adjusting the strap of my bag, feeling the familiar pull of its weight. Not burdensome anymore, just present. We exchanged a brief handshake. Not warm, not cold, simply human. A gesture that acknowledged we had both carried something heavy, even if differently. Then I walked toward the door, the faint echo of my steps trailing across the carpeted floor. No one followed. No one called after me. The moment didn't need words. As I stepped into the hallway's softer light, I felt a quiet sense of alignment, as though something long out of place had finally clicked back into position. Whatever came next would be mine to build, with room now, for breath, for choice, for a future unentangled from debt. The building's lobby greeted me with its muted hum, the kind produced by a mix of distant conversations and soft fluorescent light. I paused for a moment near the elevator, letting my breathing settle after the long negotiation. The glass doors reflected my own shape back at me, shoulders relaxed, posture grounded, eyes clearer than they had been in months. I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag, aware of the folder resting securely inside. Not heavy anymore, just whole. People passed by, some glancing upward, others lost in their own errands. To them, I was one more figure moving through a hallway, but to myself, I felt like someone stepping out of a long corridor of obligation and into air that finally belonged to me again. Outside, the afternoon light had softened into a warm late-day glow. The city moved at its usual rhythm, cars shifting through lanes, crosswalks filling and emptying, someone laughing into their phone near the corner. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life. I stood still for a moment, letting that ordinariness settle on me like a reminder that conflict isn't the world. It's only a narrow part of it. The envelope with the agreement sat tucked between the folders in my bag. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough. Quiet proof that what had been tangled was now untied. I drew in a slow breath, the air cool against my lungs, grounding me in the present. I walked down the block, letting my steps fall into an unhurried rhythm. The sidewalk was lined with small shops and old brick buildings, their windows holding reflections of the sky. The simplicity of the scenery comforted me. I checked my phone once. No new messages, no unanswered calls. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like anticipation. It felt like relief. I paused near a small cafe, the scent of roasted coffee slipping out each time the door opened. For a moment, I considered going in, not to celebrate, just to sit, to exist without defending or documenting anything. But instead, I kept walking, enjoying the freedom of choosing without weight. At the crosswalk, I watched the changing light signal the shift from caution to go. The metaphor wasn't lost on me, but I didn't linger on it. I simply crossed, feeling the faint breeze tug at my sleeves. My phone vibrated once with a message from my friend. Did it go okay? I typed back a simple response. Yes, it's done. She sent a line of confetti emojis followed by, "You deserve peace." I locked my screen and slipped the phone away. Her words stayed with me, threading themselves quietly through the steady beat of my steps. Peace didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived like this. Subtle, steady, almost unnoticed until you feel how quiet your own mind has become. I reached my car and leaned lightly against the door before unlocking it. The metal was warm from the sun, carrying a low heat that felt grounding against my palm. I rested there for a moment, letting the finality of the day sink in. What had once felt like a mountain now sat behind me, reduced to a series of signed pages and a single check folded between them. I opened the door, set my bag on the passenger seat, and watched the folder settle gently into place. There was no triumph in the gesture, only completion. A simple, necessary close to something that had lingered far too long. Before starting the engine, I sat in the driver's seat, hands resting lightly on the wheel. The late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the parking lot, the kind that hint at evening but don't rush it. I let my shoulders sink, my breath lengthen, my thoughts unclench. The truth was intact, my boundaries were intact, and I had walked away without losing myself to anger or uncertainty. When I finally turned the key, the engine hummed to life, soft, steady, uncomplicated. I pulled out of the lot with the calm of someone who had learned exactly how much strength quietness can hold. The drive home felt strangely weightless. The city unfolded in familiar lines, traffic lights blinking through tree branches, storefronts reflecting the soft tilt of late daylight, but everything looked slightly different, as if the world had shifted half an inch to the left. I kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on my lap, my mind finally free from the loops it had replayed for months. No more drafting emails in my head, no more anticipating angles or counter-arguments. The road ahead stretched clean and uncomplicated. I rolled down the window for a moment, letting the wind thread through my hair. It felt like the first unmeasured breath I'd taken in a long time. When I reached home, I placed the folder on my dining table. Not in the center, not with ceremony, just there, resting quietly on the wood. The sunlight from the window touched its edges, warming the cover slightly. I ran my fingers along the spine, acknowledging it the way someone acknowledges a companion who has traveled far alongside them. It wasn't an object of tension anymore. It wasn't a shield or a burden. It was simply the record of a journey that had ended. I didn't open it. I didn't need to revisit a single page. The truth inside had already done its work. I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the window, the evening breeze slipping softly through the screen. Outside, a few children rode bicycles along the sidewalk, their laughter rising in short bursts, unrestrained and bright. I watched them for a moment, letting their joy wash through the quiet inside me. Life had kept moving all this time, even while I stood in courtrooms of conversation and negotiations thick with strain. Now, I could step back into that movement without feeling out of rhythm. The stillness I carried wasn't heaviness anymore, it was space. Later, I folded the signed agreement and placed it in a drawer, one that held passports, warranties, and other documents that mattered but didn't need daily attention. The act felt symbolic in its simplicity. This chapter didn't require display or discussion. It didn't need retelling. It just needed to rest where completed things belong. When I closed the drawer, the soft click felt like punctuation again. A quiet, firm period at the end of a paragraph I was finally ready to leave behind. I stepped onto my porch as the sky shifted into early night. A faint hum of insects filled the air, steady and unbothered. The world felt balanced in a way that didn't demand interpretation. It simply existed, unchanged and dependable. I leaned against the railing, letting the wood press gently into my palms. For the first time in months, I sensed the future without the shadow of unfinished business stretching across it. Not a dramatic new beginning, not a triumphant rebirth, just a clear, open space where my life could unfold without interruption. F. Before heading inside, I took one last breath of the cooling air. The day had been long, dense with procedure and resolution. Yet the quiet settling now was soft, almost delicate. I walked back through my doorway and turned off the porch light. The room behind me calm and waiting. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to justify. Only the life I would continue building. Steady, thoughtful, entirely my own. And as the door clicked gently shut, I felt a certainty settle in my chest. I had not only reclaimed my voice, I had reclaimed my peace. In the end, it wasn't the check, the signatures, or the agreement that stayed with me. It was the quiet. The kind that settles over your life when a long, exhausting chapter finally closes. I drove home with the windows half open, letting the late daylight wash through the car like a gentle reminder that peace doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives in small breaths, in unclenched hands, in the knowledge that you stood up for yourself without losing who you were. That night, I placed the folder in a drawer and let it rest. No more revisiting, no more rehearsing. The house, the repairs, the arguments, they all belonged to the past now. What remained was the steady awareness that boundaries can be drawn softly and still hold firm. That truth, when organized and spoken plainly, has a way of settling everything around it. And as I turned off the lights and stepped toward the quiet of my evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Room. Space to breathe. Space to rebuild. Space to choose what comes next, without debt or shadows. And / this story resonated with you. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.